AAA gaming is in trouble. I don't know if you noticed. AAA games are like blockbuster movies. They have big budgets and are generally the ones that are going to get the most attention. There's no official amount a budget has to surpass to be considered AAA, but it's generally agreed that it needs to be around 100 million or higher. These started cropping up in the early 3D era, when the visual storytelling aspects of these games became more viable. See Final Fantasy VII or Shenmue for examples. If you wanted a good gaming experience, you could pick up a AAA game and, in most cases, come out with a satisfying experience. But recently, that's become more and more of a rarity. That's not to say there aren't still great AAA games coming out, just look at Baldur's Gate 3. But for the most part, these expensive projects are starting to feel like shells of their former selves. These games, with all the edge and personality sanded off, lean too much on spectacle and feel like factory-produced slop. So, what happened to AAA games? You see, a lot of this can be traced back to the graphical fidelity these games indulge in. As technology advances, developers are able to create experiences that look more and more lifelike. But creating games that look like this takes a lot. You need people to create high-quality models with ultra-high definition texture work. You need to motion capture all the animations so they look realistic. Have complicated lighting systems rigged up. There's ray tracing and particle effects. There are little details that make the characters feel alive, horse testicles, fish AI, and so much more on top of that. Doing this takes a lot of time and a whole lot of money. But hey, people like pretty games, and many such games have seen tremendous success. The problem is that developers are always pushing to make their games have better graphics with each release, and as they've done so, budgets have ballooned in size, especially in recent years. Now, AAA games make diminishing returns on release because so much money went into making them pretty. Sure, there are people who obsess over graphics, comparing the eyeballs of AAA characters to see whose is best, but that doesn't automatically mean a good-looking game is going to sell well. Just look at the recently released Hellblade 2. This game is gorgeous, there's no denying that, but the gameplay is rather one note, feeling more like a QuickTime event than something more skill-based. And after 5 years of development, the game's only 5 hours. It's clear to me that a lot of time went into the visuals, but that wasn't enough. The game couldn't even crack into the top 20 Xbox games at launch, and it only had 4,000 players on Steam in its first week. For perspective, that's less than Redfall had. Redfall. They were so focused on making their game pretty when they should have focused on creating more engaging gameplay. But it's a AAA game, so it has to look top of the line. That's what all the time and budget went towards. And that's the case for a lot of these games. Sure, some are successes, as previously mentioned, but even those end up spending more money than needed. Insomniac's Spider-Man 2 ended up being triple the budget of the first game, but can you honestly tell? And it's not just me asking that. According to the leaked internal documents, the developers are asking themselves the same question. This game takes place largely in the same place as the last game. Those assets were already made. Don't tell me they remade everything just for a micro increase in fidelity. Why do that? If you had to spend money on something, why not put it towards getting a better script, or making these characters not look like they just walked out of the uncanny valley? Just because you put in triple the money to make the game doesn't mean you get triple the amount back. Now, it will profit, it's Spider-Man after all, but it's going to have a significantly smaller profit margin, and it's just not sustainable. There's a clear belief in the AAA scene that the prettier the graphics, the higher the sales will be. But if we look at the list of the top-selling video games, we can see that the top-selling game of all time is Minecraft, which looks like this. Just a few spots below that is Terraria, and further down we have Stardew Valley. These games aren't ugly, but they don't have AAA visuals either, yet they've sold amazingly. Why? It's because they have gameplay that's compelling to people. They're not realistic looking, but they don't have to be. People just have fun with these games, and that's ultimately what games need to succeed, to be fun. Realistic graphics have their place, don't get me wrong. Right under Minecraft on the list is GTA 5, but it should be clear that expensive visuals don't guarantee success, and you're better off investing that money into ensuring the game is something people want to engage with. But the graphical fidelity isn't just ballooning the budget, but also the amount of time it takes to make these games. The more details they add, the longer it takes to create, which means that we ultimately get fewer games over a period of time. Less games for us to play means less for companies to sell. Let's take a look back at the 7th generation of consoles to really paint a picture of how bad things have gotten. This generation began in late 2005 with the release of the Xbox 360. And while you can argue the next generation started in 2012 with the release of the Wii U, I believe it didn't truly start till the Xbox One and the PS4 came in late 2013. That's an 8-year console generation. In that time, Naughty Dog released 3 Uncharted games, and The Last of Us. Insomniac released 4 mainline Ratchet & Clanks and the 3 Resistances on top of that. Bethesda Games gave us 2 Elder Scrolls and a Fallout. Epic Games gave us 3 Gears of War games and a spin-off. We had 2.5 Halos from Bungie and another from 343. We had 2 Grand Theft Autos, Red Dead Redemption, Max Payne 3, and LA Noire from Rockstar Games. BioWare created the Mass Effect trilogy and the first 2 Dragon Age games. Gearbox created 2 Borderlands games. Rocksteady gave us 2 Batman Arkham games. Media Molecule developed Little Big Planet 1 and 2. And Santa Monica gave us God of War 3 and Ascension. Now let's go to the 8th generation, which spanned from late 2013 to late 2020. That's 7 years. Graphics are now even prettier and require more development time. What does that result in? Naughty Dog released The Last of Us Part 2 and 1.5 Uncharted games. Insomniac released Sunset Overdrive, 1 Ratchet & Clank, and Spider-Man. Bethesda Game Studios released just Fallout 4. The Coalition took over for Gears of War and released 2 games and a spin-off. 343 released Halo 5 Guardians. Rockstar Games released Red Dead Redemption 2. BioWare released Dragon Age Inquisition, Mass Effect Andromeda, and Anthem. Gearbox released 1 Borderlands game, and Rocksteady released 1 Batman Arkham game. Media Molecule released Tearaway for the Vita, and then 7 years later released Dreams, which had server shut down 3 years later. And then Santa Monica had a single God of War game. That's definitely a big drop in quantity, and in some cases, quality. That's not to say all studios put out fewer games, just look at Guerrilla Games or Crystal Dynamics. They had a pretty consistent release schedule. But for the most part, developers were just putting out fewer games than they used to. And now, 4 years into the 9th generation, it seems the gap between releases is only widening. Now, I'm not accusing developers of hoarding games from us or being lazy. It's in their best interest to release as many products as possible. But trying to have their games stand on par with their dazzling contemporaries takes more and more time as technology improves and the graphical standard is raised. Now, I can only speak for myself here, but I would much rather have my games go back to looking like PS3 games and have a more consistent release schedule than have to wait a whole console generation for the sequel to a game I like. It's hard to retain interest in a series when the releases are far apart, and the extended development time can lead to heightened expectations. It'll take a miracle for Elder Scrolls 6 to appease most people with how long it's taken. Now, look at Resident Evil. This is a series that has had a constant release for past generations, and there are more rumored to come. How does Capcom put out such quality games at such a consistent rate? Well, for one, their RE engine is forged by the gods, but they also aren't afraid of reusing assets. Now, when used irresponsibly, old assets can seem lazy and out of place. But to me, these assets never really stood out, and their use allowed Capcom to put their focus into other things and get these games out in a reasonable time. And judging by these sales numbers, it seemed these reused assets didn't bother most people either. Developers should really consider reusing already made assets whenever possible. It's not necessary to remake every single piece of a game if the old pieces work just as well. Oh no, this crate has a slightly lower poly count than it would have had they remade it. Who cares? A couple of people on Twitter? Who really think people are going to catch wind that a game used the same destroyed truck model and decide not to buy the product? You can save so much time and money doing this. Look at Majora's Mask. This game heavily reused stuff from its predecessor, the NPCs, the UI, items, enemies, but because of that, they were able to develop it in just 15 months, and now this game is a beloved classic. But if you want a better example of a studio smartly reusing old assets, then look no further than Ryo ga Gotoku Studios. Since the first Yakuza's release in 2005, they've consistently put out a game nearly every year. How can a game as cinematic and content-rich as Yakuza come out so often? It's because RGG is very smart how it reuses content. Locations, characters, animations, minigames, all these pop up through several of the games. That's not to say it's the same stuff over and over. With every entry, they always make sure to throw in new stuff on top of that. Obviously the story's different, but they also throw in a new city, some new fighting moves, minigames, new playable characters, karaoke songs. They even changed the genre. That's not to say the graphics have remained stagnant though. They've gradually gotten better and better. The reuse of assets has certainly helped. But another thing is that RGG keeps the scope focused. Scope creep. Many projects can suffer from people wanting to go bigger and bigger, and for whatever reason, there's this belief that smaller, more linear experiences are objectively worse than the larger open world ones. People see open world games as an evolution of linear games, when the truth is they both have their place. But unfortunately, we get so many big open world games, and they always go on and on about the size. Look how big the map is, it's twice the size of the first one. And what exactly can you do in these maps? Well, because these worlds are so big they can't feasibly fill them with unique content, doing so would take far too long and cost too much. These games already burn a hole in the company's pocket, so as a result, these big open worlds just have a lot of the same stuff copy and pasted all over. Collect these, climb up these towers, take down these enemy strongholds, and the rest of the world filled with big empty space, save for some resources you can use in a slapdash crafting system, and weapons you can find that do 5% more damage if they don't break after a couple swings. I may get some pushback for this, but I think these open world games need to be significantly scaled down. That way developers are able to fill it with unique content. It's not really fun to explore when I just stumble across the same stuff over and over again. But CRT, I hear you say. Didn't you just say studios should be more open to reusing assets? It's true that reusing these towers, these enemy strongholds, or these shrines significantly cuts down development time and costs. But when you're making a game about discovery, copying and pasting the same thing all over this big world makes it feel really small. Reuse assets, yes, but do it smartly. But if it's not big open worlds that are the latest trend in video games, then it's the live service game. Games like Fortnite, Apex Legends, and Destiny 2. These games, sometimes free to play, sometimes full price, provide content over a period of time in hopes that players will stick with it and purchase things, usually cosmetics. Because making money is the name of the game, these developers are trying to nickel and dime every part of the game experience they can. For free to play, it's understandable. They have to make their money back somehow. But because these games are free, they often get marketed to the kids because, hey, they don't have money. Then, once the kids are invested, they end up begging their parents to buy them a battle pass or V-Bucks. Or more often than not, they'll just steal their parents' credit card. I've heard many stories that end this way. And these games' main pages are always littered with stuff advertising what's available in the shop. It just comes across as gross to me to have this cartoony aesthetic and free admission, and then throw these optional purchases in their faces. Kids are impressionable and often don't understand the value of money. It just comes across as advantageous. But not all purchases are cosmetic, some even affect the game's meta. Just look at most mobile games or recent sports games for examples. Now it's not about skill, it's about how much cash you are willing to fork over to get the advantage. Because that's why I play video games, so I can have a money slapping fight with people. Not to mention there's some FOMO involved as well with these season passes. If you miss out on getting it, it's gone, and there's no telling if or when it will come back. Remember when you can just play a game and not have to worry about putting any more money in because you already paid for it? And to unlock stuff in multiplayer, you just had to play the game? Good times. It's even worse when this sort of stuff starts infecting already established franchises. Remember when Grand Theft Auto 4 had 2 single-player DLCs? Remember when GTA 5 canceled their single-player DLC to focus on the online mode that was making them lots of money? I love modern gaming. But an even more egregious example is the recent Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League. I talked about them before briefly, but Rocksteady Studios was best known for their Batman Arkham series, a collection of great single-player action-adventure games. In 2015, they released Arkham Knight, and after that, the studio went silent. We went the rest of the console generation wondering just what they were cooking up. Was it a follow-up to the Arkham games, or perhaps they were taking up another superhero? Superman, maybe? Soon, rumors started coming out that they were developing a Suicide Squad game. Some people were upset they weren't getting their Batman game, but many held their tongues and waited for more information to come out. And then the news broke. Rocksteady's next entry in the Arkhamverse, Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League, will be an online-only, cooperative, third-person shooter live service game. People were not pleased. What was even more insulting is that this diverse lineup of characters all played the same. Deadshot shooting a gun, sure, of course, but Captain Boomerang and King Shark? But they had to do it this way. They didn't have time to make the characters unique and give them unique weapons. This is a live service game. You can't efficiently churn out content when you have to make different stuff for different characters. Oh, and does this game have stuff to sell you? This full-priced, $70 game wants even more of your money than you already forked over. Rocksteady basically wasted an entire decade on this game, a game that is already showing signs of rigor mortis. At the time we're writing this, the game has nearly the same number of players as Avengers, a game that was delisted and had its own online functionality shut down. It's so over. And what sucks is that you know this game wasn't Rocksteady's idea. It's never really the developer's fault in these cases. No, the idea to create Suicide Squad came from a higher up who saw the success of other live service games and decided to get themselves a slice of that pie. But what these suits don't understand is that for the most part, it's already too late to get in on the live service trend. These games incentivize players to play every day, do their daily login and their daily challenges. It's like a job. It's a commitment. Most people only have enough time to dedicate themselves to one or two of these. There's not a lot of room to muscle yourself in. On top of that, you have to convince people who have already invested money into these games for possibly years to leave those behind and come to your live service game that has less content and may not even be running in a year or two. Oh, and when these games fail, they fail hard. Because you need to constantly pump out content at a consistent rate, these projects require a large budget. So when there's no player base to buy these microtransactions and season passes, it bleeds a lot of money. I want to believe the games industry will learn its lesson from failures like this in Avengers, but only a month after Suicide Squad released, Warner Bros. Discovery CEO J.B. Perret said they planned on taking its beloved IP and trying to wring more money out of them with live service. This industry is like a dog who keeps running into a glass door trying to get outside. They just never learn. Oh, and this isn't just bad for us as consumers, but also for the developers. Let's talk about what it's like to be a developer working on these high-end video games. Having to create content that is very high fidelity at a consistent rate takes a lot of time and effort. You can't just snap your fingers and have it done. But uh-oh, the higher-ups did a bad job estimating how much time they would need, and this game needs to be out by the holiday season. This leads to crunch. You're gonna have to tell your kid happy birthday over the phone because you need to come in over the weekend to make sure the horse's testicles contract in the cold properly. Multiple developers have had instances of crunch where employees work a ridiculous number of hours a week, often for months. Some have even had weeks that average 100 hours. All this they have to suffer just for a detail in the game that makes most players go, oh neat, before moving on and never thinking about it again. And even if you do your job as a developer and your game is finished, even if it's nominated for Game of the Year, there's still a pretty good chance you get sacked. Layoffs have become an unfortunately common occurrence in the AAA space, especially recently. Studios are either dramatically downsizing or shutting down altogether. A lot of this can be linked back to the events of 2020. Because of the pandemic, people were stuck inside, so with not much else to do, many took up video games to help pass the time, and because of that, the games industry was thriving. Companies were reporting record-breaking sales during this time period. There was a rising demand for video games, so companies responded by bolstering their numbers and expanding their studios. But as the pandemic started slowing down, people started going back to work and going outside more, meaning there were fewer people playing games. And because of this, companies all over started reporting that they were making substantially less than they did in 2020. And of course they were. This spike in sales only happened because of specific circumstances. It was never permanent. Did they really believe every single person who took up gaming as a hobby during this time would stick with it when they had the ability to return to their old way of life? And even if they did stick with the hobby, did they really think they could sink the same amount of time into it as they did during the pandemic? But none of this matters to shareholders. These people don't need expertise, all they needed was money. It doesn't matter to them if the company still made a profit. It's not as much as last year's, and as we all know, the line must go up. So what do? Well, they just cut back on all those expansions they made, shutting down studios and putting thousands out of a job. Over 10,000 jobs were lost in 2023, another 10,000 were lost in 2024, a year we're only halfway through. And you just know that the people up top are unaffected. They always are. In fact, they probably gave themselves a huge bonus to celebrate the occasion. Phil Spencer can act like closing Tango Gameworks was a hard decision, but I bet the fat check tucked between his blazer and relatable graphic tee made it a bit easier. How are you going to get people interested in working in an industry when you overwork and fire them constantly? And if you can't retain employees and eventually promote them, you'll be left with the same people who keep mismanaging things in charge. When I read about some suit who invested a lot of money into a developer making awful decisions, it just makes me wish gaming could go back to being something more niche. Back when there wasn't all this big money backing it. Games used to be made by smaller teams, comprised of people with a genuine love for gaming. They wanted to make something cool that they'd like to play. Now everything's so corporate, and AAA looks more like a collection of office jobs. And because there's so much money behind these projects now, these companies try to reach as wide an audience as possible, meaning anything that can be perceived as an edge gets sanded down. Don't want to upset people who aren't going to buy the game in the first place. If you hear a developer talk about how they made a game for the modern audience, take that as a huge red flag. When you set out to make a game that's for everyone, you end up making it for no one. These games have negative personality. You can feel the writing rooms and designers tiptoeing around, trying to make something as inoffensive as possible. The white bread of video games, completely soulless. But maybe that sentiment is more true than we realize, because pretty soon we could potentially lose that human element. I'm talking about AI, and not the kind that NPCs have. More and more developers have come out saying they wish to implement AI in the creative process. To what extent has yet to be seen, but this could put the jobs of many developers at risk. Why hire someone to create textures when you can have an AI do it for a fraction of the cost? Now, AI has yet to perfectly create art in a way human can, and its work has many telltale signs. It's always the hands. But what about when AI improves and is capable of creating art that is indistinguishable from the humans? Is that what we want to play? Games that are filled with assets churned out from a computer, completely devoid from any artistic vision or emotion? And on top of all that, they're starting to charge more for their games. In an economy where people are trying to save money, they want to charge you more for games that are unfinished or filled with microtransactions. Get your AAA slop for $70, bend over. Industry leaders are already starting to ponder raising prices even more. It's no wonder people are speculating that we're due for another video game crash, similar to the one the industry suffered in 1983. Now, personally, I think video games are much too big these days to suffer a crash of that scale. People still want to play games and buy them. That's not stopping. However, with these ballooning budgets and diminishing returns, I could see a future where AAA developers are forced to reevaluate how they create these games. Maybe they'll scale back to graphical fidelity and instead put out more, smaller, refined games. There's a reason this meme resonates with so many people and keeps getting shared on social media. Will they get the message, or will the industry continue its decay? But we shouldn't sit around and wait for the AAA industry to collapse under its own weight, when another solution is right in front of us. Indie games. Indie games are created by significantly smaller teams. Sometimes it's really just one dude. There's no large multi-million-dollar budget, and because of that, indie developers are able to experiment and make something they're passionate about. A Souls-like where you play as a hermit crab, a 3D platformer where you play as a leggy furry woman jumping around a distorted castle, a digital pet game where you have to raise a hero to fight the demon lord. Indie games have so much more to offer than AAA and have much more personality on top of that. And this is just a small sample. They're also cheaper and take up far less memory. Over 200 gigabytes? Are you high? Because your file size is. If you're getting burned out with the AAA scene, consider giving these smaller games a shot. They won't have the high fidelity graphics you're used to, but with all the variety the indie scene has, you're bound to find something that'll suit you. And really dig deep into what indie games are on offer. Don't just rely on Nintendo Indie Directs to get your recommendations. Those games are great, but there's so much more on top of that. Go on Twitter and just type in indie game in the search bar. You're bound to find some developers tweeting about the game they're making. And go to their page and check out their retweets. There's a good chance they follow other indie developers and are showing off their games as well. And make sure you wishlist the games on Steam, even if the games aren't out yet. It helps to keep track of them. If they don't have a store page yet, either like the tweet or write the name of the project on a notepad app to help keep track of it. I do both. The unfortunate part of creating games with significantly smaller budgets is that there's little left for marketing. Sometimes they can get lucky with a good publisher, but most of the time the people in charge of marketing these games are the same guys making them. And because of that, lots of indies can fly under people's radar. Social media is the best place to promote these games, but it's still not perfect. So it's really up to us, the consumers, to spread the word about these. If you've played any indie games you think deserve more attention, let people know. If I could do one thing for this channel, it would be to shine a spotlight on indie games, because I truly think that's where most of the passion is in the gaming scene. Now, I'm not going to act like a complete doomer who says AAA has nothing more to offer us, but I do think the AAA scene is a shell of its former self, and if we want to continue playing the best gaming has to offer, we should expand our horizons.